The president's claims that a deal to end the war with Iran could happen as soon as this weekend. An Iranian official telling MS Now that things are, quote, moving quickly, all as key national security surveillance powers are set to lapse on Capitol Hill. And joining us now is New Hampshire Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen, the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thanks so much for taking the time. President Trump, once again, is saying a deal with Iran is imminent, that coming hours after he had threatened more strikes and after days of uncertainty. An Iranian official telling us this morning things are moving quickly. Senator, do you believe a real agreement is actually close, or is this just more of that same merry-go-round of starts, stops, and shifting signals?
Well, it's hard to know. Obviously, we've heard this from the president multiple times. But I think the real question is what would be the details that would be included in this deal? And so far, from what we've heard, it doesn't address any of the goals that the president had laid out at the beginning of this war. So we have a more hardline regime in place in Tehran.
Hey everyone, Jack here. So this is what just happened, guys. Twice now, after January 6th and during a later crisis, a powerful coalition of labor unions, including the 12 million-member AFL-CIO, activists and officials demanded Trump resign immediately, and twice he responded by digging in, lashing out, and betting the demands would fizzle. The question is whether the third time might finally be different, but here is what makes that moment even more remarkable. The calls for Trump's resignation after January 6th were not limited to labor unions or Democratic politicians. Two Republican senators went on the record publicly urging Trump to resign. Lisa Murkowski and Pat Toomey, both Republicans, both willing to break ranks and say that the president of their own party needed to step down immediately.
It doesn't address proxies, groups like Hezbollah and Hamas that have been funded by Iran. It doesn't address, it's not clear how it would address their nuclear stockpile, and whether, from what's being reported, it would not be any better, in fact, probably worse than the deal that President Trump pulled the United States out of in his first term. So we really need to see what the details are.
Right, and the details are under discussion still, it appears, and Iran and the Trump administration are not aligning in what they're saying is in this agreement. So we are also working to find out what the details are. Meanwhile, FISA is set to expire in just hours. This provides the key surveillance authorities for the intel community that we've discussed. Democrats refusing to extend FISA in protest of Trump's pick for acting DNI, Bill Pulte. Senator, we're in the middle of the World Cup. There are multiple events tied to America's 250th anniversary, not to mention the war with Iran. How concerned are you about FISA powers not being in place?
In the modern political environment where Republican elected officials almost never cross Trump, that was seismic. Two Republican senators calling for a Republican president to resign is not normal. It is not routine. It is a sign that something fundamentally broken has occurred. And the American people agreed. An ABC News and Ipsos poll conducted in the immediate aftermath found that 56% of Americans believe Trump should be removed from office before his term ended. That is a majority of the country, not a slim majority either. A clear, unmistakable majority saying that the president needed to go. Now, you might think that kind of pressure would produce some kind of accountability.
We just learned, get this, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, has just announced he's resigning. CNN national security reporter Zachary Cohn is joining us right now. Zachary, what more can you tell us about this dramatic development?
Yeah, Wolf, this appears to be a significant resignation at the senior-most levels of the Trump intelligence community. This is Joe Kent. He was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He appearing to post on X a resignation letter that he submitted citing misgivings over the Trump administration's decision to launch its war with Iran. Now, Kent, in this letter, writes in part, quote, as a veteran who deployed to combat 11 times and as a Gold Star husband who lost my beloved wife Shannon in a war manufactured by Israel, I cannot support sending the next generation off to fight and die in a war that serves no benefit to the American people, nor justifies the cost of American lives. Now, Kent, in his apparent post on X does also seem to suggest that there was no imminent threat that it has been used and cited by the Trump administration as justification for launching this war against Iran. He says that
you might think that with labor unions, Republican senators, and a majority of the American public all saying the same thing, something would have to give. But here is where the pattern gets interesting. PBS documented exactly how Trump responded to those calls for his resignation, and his response tells you everything you need to know about how he operates under pressure. He refused to accept any responsibility for what had happened. Not a shred, not an ounce. He did not express regret. He did not acknowledge that the attack on the Capitol was his fault, even though every credible investigation has since confirmed that his words and actions directly contributed to the violence. Instead of accountability, he planned border wall photo ops. He wanted to project normalcy.
Essentially, the administration manufactured this idea of an imminent threat, and that is part of the reason why he's deciding to resign from his post today.
Let me read a little bit from this letter that he wrote to President Trump. This is Joseph Kent. He works for the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. But he writes this. He says, I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. I support the values and the foreign policies that you campaigned on in 2016, 2020, 2024, which you enacted in your first term. Until June of 2025, you understood that the wars in the Middle East were a trap that robbed America of the precious lives of our patriots and depleted the wealth and prosperity of our nation. And he added this. In your first administration, you understood better than any modern president how to decisively apply military power without getting us drawn into never-ending wars. You demonstrated this.
He wanted to look like a president doing president things rather than a president who had just overseen an attack on the very institution of American democracy. And here is the detail that I find most revealing about his psychological state during that period. According to the PBS coverage and other contemporaneous reporting, Trump was privately raging about losing his Twitter account. That was what occupied his focus in the immediate aftermath of the Capitol attack. Not the deaths, not the injuries, not the desecration of the people's house, not the constitutional crisis unfolding around him. His Twitter account, the suspension of his favorite megaphone, the platform that had amplified every grievance, every attack, every conspiracy theory for years, was suddenly gone, and that personal loss consumed him. Aides described him as apoplectic. He could not focus on anything else. The man was facing calls for his resignation from every corner of American institutional life, and he was furious about losing his ability to tweet. That is the behavioral pattern. That is the Trump playbook under pressure. Personal grievance over everything. Attack the critics, refuse accountability, and bet that the demands will fizzle. Now fast forward 5 years to the second crisis moment in this documented pattern. The specific triggering event is different, but the structural dynamic is exactly the same. Trump had made an explosive threat about wiping out a civilization and bombing critical infrastructure if a foreign power did not comply with his demands. The exact details of that threat and the diplomatic crisis it created are covered in other scripts in this series, but what matters for understanding the resign now pattern is what happened next. More than 70 Democratic lawmakers in Congress publicly called for Trump's immediate removal via either impeachment or the 25th Amendment. NBC News documented these calls extensively. Senators Ed Markey and Chris Murphy, along with Representative Ro Khanna, were among the most prominent voices making the demand. And they used strikingly specific language. Senator Markey said that no president in control of his senses would make such threats. That phrase, in control of his senses, is a direct reference to the 25th Amendment, which allows for the removal of a president who is unable to discharge his duties. The civilization will die post, as it came to be known, triggered an absolute firestorm of public outrage. According to documentation from congressional offices, a single office received 257 calls in a single day demanding Trump's removal. not spread out over a week. In one day, 257 individual constituents calling to say that the president needed to go. That is not a trickle of discontent. That is a flood of rage. The Institutional Accountability Coalition that formed after January 6th looked different in this second crisis. The AFL-CIO was not the lead voice this time. The labor movement's relationship with the second Trump term had evolved, complicated by economic policies that were directly affecting workers' living costs. But the Democratic caucus in Congress stepped into the void. 70-plus members of the House and Senate publicly calling for removal is a significant institutional expression of accountability pressure. It is not the same configuration as the January 6th coalition, but the structural demand is identical. The president has done something so dangerous, so beyond the bounds of acceptable conduct, that he cannot be allowed to remain in office for another minute. And just like in the first crisis, Trump's response followed the exact same behavioral pattern. His Truth Social account, which he now had as a direct amplification channel after being banned from Twitter in the first term, lit up with 1 a.m. meltdowns. He threatened that all hell would rain down on his opponents. He escalated his rhetoric to new heights of aggression. He named and attacked his congressional critics directly, accusing them of treason and demanding that they be prosecuted. The fury was directed at the very people who had the constitutional responsibility to hold him accountable. And just like after January 6th, he refused to engage with the substance of the accountability demands. He did not explain why his threats were justified. He did not offer evidence that he was in control of his faculties. He just attacked, he raged, he screamed, he bet that the demands would fizzle. Let me pause here and make sure you fully understand why documenting this pattern across two separate crises, rather than covering each event in isolation, is actually the most politically revealing approach to this entire story. Because each individual wave of resignation calls, whether after January 6th or after the Iran war threats, has been covered extensively in its own news cycle at the time it happened. The congressional statements, the public opinion polls, the union calls, the defiant responses from Trump, all of that was reported when it occurred. But here is what those individual news cycles missed. When you step back and look at the two moments side by side, you see that the exact same structural dynamic produced the exact same outcome on both occasions. Crisis triggers resign, now demands from a significant institutional coalition. Trump digs in and refuses to engage with the accountability framing. And the demands eventually fizzle without forcing any actual action. That observation is politically significant because it tells you something crucial about the accountability architecture that has been operating for the past several years. The resign now demands are real. They are not fringe noise or performative political theater. They reflect a genuine assessment from institutional actors and from a significant portion of the American public that Trump's conduct has crossed a line that warrants immediate removal from office. The AFL-CIO does not call for a president's resignation lightly. Republican senators do not call for their own party's president to step down unless something genuinely catastrophic has occurred. And a majority of the American public does not tell pollsters that the president should be removed unless they have reached a serious conclusion about his fitness to serve. These demands are real expressions of accountability pressure. But here is the harsh reality that the pattern reveals. The demands themselves, absent the specific constitutional mechanisms that can actually force a president to leave office against his will, do not produce removal. Trump's bet that the demands will fizzle has been correct twice. Understanding why that bet keeps working, and what would need to change for the pattern to produce a different outcome in the future, is the specific analytical contribution that this pattern examination makes. So let me walk you through the specific documented elements of each crisis moment carefully, and then we will examine what the pattern they form together reveals about the limits and possibilities of presidential accountability in the current political environment. Starting with the January 6th resignation call wave, which is the more extensively documented of the two moments and the one that produced the most varied institutional expressions of the resign now demand. The AFL-CIO's national board called on Trump to resign or be removed from office at once. Let me emphasize again that the AFL-CIO is not some small advocacy group. It is the largest labor union federation in the United States, representing approximately 12 million workers across every sector of the economy. When their national board speaks, especially in such urgent and unambiguous language, it is a significant political event. Their framing of the Capitol riot as one of the greatest attacks on American democracy in the nation's history was not hyperbole. It was an institutional judgment from a body that represents millions of American families. The specific language they used, resign or be removed at once, whether through impeachment or the 25th Amendment, reflects the urgency of that moment and the institutional judgment that normal political processes were completely inadequate to address the crisis the Capitol attack represented. Senator Lisa Murkowski's call for Trump to resign and Senator Pat Toomey's similar statement are the documented Republican voices that made the demand at least nominally bipartisan. Now, 2 Republican senators is a small fraction of the overall Republican caucus. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But 2 Republican senators calling for their own party's president to resign in the immediate aftermath of an attack on the Capitol, going on the record publicly with those demands, is a documented departure from the normal Republican pattern of silence on accountability questions that touch Trump. In normal times, Republican elected officials almost never break with a president of their own party on matters this serious. The fact that 2 of them did, and that several more expressed private reservations that never became public statements, tells you something about how dramatically the January 6th event shifted the political calculus, at least temporarily. The ABC News and Ipsos poll finding that 56% of Americans thought Trump should be removed before his term ended is the public opinion measure of how extensively the resignation demand was shared among ordinary Americans, not just institutional actors and political figures. That is a majority of the country. More than half of your fellow citizens told a pollster that they believed the president needed to be removed from office immediately. That is not a close call. That is a clear and unmistakable verdict from the American people. And Trump's documented response to those January 6th resignation calls is the behavioral record that PBS captured in its coverage titled "Defiant" amid calls to resign. He refused to accept responsibility. He would not acknowledge that his words and actions had contributed to the violence. Instead of accountability, he planned border wall photo ops, projecting normalcy and policy activity as if nothing had happened. He privately raged about losing his Twitter account, the suspension of his favorite social media amplification platform, becoming the personal grievance that occupied his focus in the immediate aftermath of the Capitol attack. Aides described him as apoplectic over the social media suspension. Apoplectic. That is the word they used. He was beside himself with rage about Twitter, not about the deaths, not about the constitutional crisis, not about the calls for his resignation from labor unions, Republican senators, and a majority of the American public. Twitter. And the PBS coverage documented the specific contrast between what the crisis demanded, which was accountability and political reckoning, and what Trump was actually focused on, which was his personal platform and personal grievances. That specific contrast between the gravity of the external crisis and the personal grievance focus of the internal response is the behavioral pattern that the second crisis moment's documented behavior mirrors almost exactly. Now let me turn to the 2026 Iran war resignation call wave. This second moment produced a different institutional configuration from the AFL-CIO plus Republican senators pattern of January 6th, but the structural dynamic is exactly the same. More than 70 Democratic lawmakers in Congress publicly called for Trump's removal via either impeachment or the 25th Amendment. NBC News documented these calls extensively, and the named voices with the most specific and quoted statements were Senator Ed Markey, Senator Chris Murphy, and Representative Ro Khanna. Senator Markey's statement that no president in control of his senses would make such threats is particularly significant because the phrase "in control of his senses" is a direct reference to the 25th Amendment's provisions for removing a president who is unable to discharge his duties. These lawmakers were not just making a political statement. They were invoking the constitutional mechanism designed specifically for situations where a president has become dangerous or incapacitated. Now, let me be very clear about the constitutional mechanics here because this is where a lot of confusion enters the conversation. The 25th Amendment cannot be invoked by Congress alone. It requires the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare that the President is unable to discharge his duties. Without the Vice President's participation, the amendment is functionally unavailable as a removal mechanism. The 70 calls from Democratic lawmakers are political pressure communications rather than operational invocations of the constitutional mechanism. But they are documented institutional expressions of the exact same resign now demand that the AFL-CIO and the Republican senators expressed after January 6th. Different institutional actors at a different crisis moment producing the same structure of demand. The president must go. He cannot be allowed to remain in office. Immediate action is required. The defiant response pattern in 2026 is documented across multiple sources. The 1 a.m. Truth Social meltdowns where Trump posted angry rants in the middle of the night. The all hell will rain down escalation rhetoric where he promised dire consequences for his political opponents. The attacks on domestic critics by name, singling out individual lawmakers for public abuse and threats. The fury directed at congressional members who voted for the War Powers Resolution seeking to constrain his military authority. The 2026 defiant response is louder and more publicly aggressive than the 2021 response, partly because Trump is in office rather than about to leave, so the stakes of resignation are higher for him, and partly because the Truth Social platform gives him a direct amplification channel that the Twitter suspension took away from him in 2021. But the behavioral elements are the same. Personal grievance focus. Attack the critics pattern. Refusal to accept the accountability framing that the resignation calls are trying to impose. The tools available to express the defiance have expanded in the second term, but the underlying psychology appears identical. The comparison between the two moments also reveals something important about how organized labor's relationship with the second Trump term has evolved. The AFL-CIO made a national board statement calling for immediate removal after January 6th. That was a powerful and unambiguous institutional intervention. But the second term's most economically consequential policy decisions, the sweeping tariffs that the Supreme Court eventually struck down, the persistent inflation that the Iran war has accelerated, the widespread economic disruption that is driving record-low approval ratings on cost of living questions, all of these have generated their own labor sector accountability response. The labor movement that called for Trump's immediate removal in 2021 is now operating in a 2026 environment where the economic consequences of second-term policies are directly affecting its members' household budgets, their rent payments, their grocery bills, their children's school supplies. The connection between the institutional resign now demand of 2021 and the current economic and political environment is the thread that makes the then and now pattern most directly relevant to the political moment we are actually living through right now. Before I go further, I need to address something important. There have been viral social media claims circulating about 120 House members and 7 senators calling for Trump's immediate resignation after the Iran threats. These claims reference briefs from Facebook post sources that I cannot verify. And throughout this series, I have applied the same sourcing standard to every claim I make. If it is not from verified reporting by named news organizations with editorial accountability, I do not treat it as documented fact. The NBC News documentation of 70 Democratic lawmakers calling for removal via impeachment or the 25th Amendment after the Iran threats is the verified journalism on the second term resignation calls. The 120-member and 7-senator numbers from Facebook posts are viral social media characterizations that may or may not accurately reflect the documented record. I am going to use the NBC verified 70-member number as the documented figure for this script, because that is what the journalism supports. Now let me talk about the specific political significance of this pattern. Crisis produces resignation calls that do not force action. That is the analytical thread that connects the two documented moments to the broader second-term accountability picture we have been assembling throughout this series. In previous scripts, we have covered how judicial constraints are the most consistently effective accountability mechanism in the current environment. Federal judges issuing rulings that constrain executive action have been far more successful at checking Trump than any political process has been. We have covered how the 25th Amendment is functionally unavailable without vice presidential participation, which has not been forthcoming and shows no signs of becoming available. We have covered how impeachment is Congress's specific accountability lane and why the upcoming electoral outcome will determine whether that lane has a majority to use it. The resignation calls fit into this architecture as the political pressure expression of accountability demand. They are the voice of institutional outrage. They are the documented record that history will point to when asking whether anyone tried to stop the abuses. But they are not, by themselves, operational mechanisms for forcing a president to leave office against his will. Let me be really clear about what the documented resign now pattern means and what it does and does not establish about the accountability trajectory going forward. The first thing you need to understand is why the resign now demands have not produced resignation and why Trump's bet that they would fizzle has been correct twice. Resignation is a voluntary act. No constitutional mechanism, absent an impeachment conviction or a successful 25th Amendment invocation, can compel a sitting president to resign against his will. Trump understands this perfectly well. He has always understood it. The 56% of Americans who told pollsters after January 6th that he should be removed, the 70-plus Democratic lawmakers who called for his removal after the Iran threats, all of those are expressions of accountability demand. They are not mechanisms for forcing the demand's fulfillment. The gap between the expression of the demand and the available mechanisms for fulfilling it is the specific gap that Trump's dig-in strategy exploits every single time. As long as Republican senators will not break in sufficient numbers to produce an impeachment conviction, and as long as the vice president and cabinet will not initiate 25th Amendment proceedings, the resign now demands remain politically significant as pressure and as historical record, but operationally ineffective as accountability mechanisms. Trump's instinct about the immediate term has been correct on both occasions. The demands fizzle. He stays. The question that remains open is what the electoral outcome will do to the longer-term picture. The second layer worth sitting with is what the AFL-CIO January 6th call and the 70 Democrat 2026 calls together reveal about the Institutional Accountability Coalition's composition and its limits. The AFL-CIO call came from organized labor representing millions of workers across every industry in America. It produced no resignation. The 70 Democrat 2026 calls came from congressional members, people who were elected specifically to hold the executive branch accountable. They produced no removal. Both institutional expressions of the resign now demand were operating in political environments where the specific constitutional mechanisms required to force action were unavailable. The Republican votes for an impeachment conviction were insufficient after January 6th, and the vice presidential participation required for the 25th Amendment was unavailable in 2026. The institutional coalition calling for resignation is documented and real. Its operational power to produce the demanded outcome is constrained by constitutional mechanisms that require the participation of actors, specifically Republican senators and the vice president, who have not been willing to participate in either crisis moment. That specific constraint is the documented political reality of both resign now moments. and understanding it is essential for anyone who wants to seriously engage with the question of presidential accountability. The third layer is the behavioral response pattern across both crisis moments and what it reveals about Trump's political psychology when he is under accountability pressure. After January 6th, he was apoplectic about Twitter, planning border wall photo ops, and refusing to accept any responsibility for what had happened. After the Iran civilization will die backlash, he was posting 1 a.m. Truth Social meltdowns, promising that all hell would rain down on his opponents, escalating his rhetoric to new heights of aggression and naming and attacking his congressional critics individually. Both responses share the same core behavioral elements: defiance that is almost theatrical in its intensity, personal grievance focus that prioritizes his own emotional needs over any substantive engagement with the crisis, attack the critics pattern that seeks to delegitimize anyone who dares to hold him accountable, and a complete refusal to engage with the accountability framing of the demands. We have documented this behavioral pattern across multiple scripts in this series: the overnight spiral, the courtroom exits, the attacks on reporters who ask hard questions. The resign now moments are the specific instances where the behavioral pattern is most starkly visible because the contrast between the gravity of the demand and the pettiness of the response is most directly documented in those moments. Now, to give the complete and fair picture that any serious analysis requires, Trump and his supporters have arguments about the resign now pattern that deserve acknowledgement. They would argue that the AFL-CIO call and the congressional resignation demands are partisan political theater, that neither the Labor Federation nor the 70 Democratic lawmakers represent a neutral assessment of his fitness to serve, but rather institutional actors whose political interests align conveniently with his removal. They would argue that the 56% January 6th polling number reflected the immediate emotional reaction to a single dramatic event rather than a considered long-term assessment, and that subsequent elections have demonstrated that the American public's considered judgment about Trump is more favorable than any single post-crisis poll would suggest. They would argue that resignation in response to political pressure would set a dangerous precedent that weakens the presidency and the constitutional structure in ways that would harm future presidents of both parties, making the country less stable and more vulnerable to political manipulation. And they would argue that his decision to remain in office after January 6th and then to win re-election in 2024 after 2 impeachments is itself the electoral vindication of his judgment that the resign now demands were partisan overreach rather than legitimate accountability. These are real arguments. The AFL-CIO is a politically aligned institution. It endorses Democratic candidates. It spends money on Democratic campaigns. Polls taken in immediate crisis moments are absolutely affected by the specific emotional intensity of that moment. And elections are the specific democratic accountability mechanism that produced Trump's return to office after he lost in 2020. These arguments deserve acknowledgement, not dismissal. But here is what those arguments run into when you apply them to the full documented pattern. The AFL-CIO's National Board statement reflects the judgment of elected union leadership representing 12 million workers whose assessment of what constituted a democratic crisis carries its own legitimacy, independent of whatever partisan political alignment the organization may have. These are not political operatives. These are people who represent the interests of working families. The 56% poll number was consistent with subsequent polling that found sustained majority disapproval of Trump's January 6th conduct in multiple survey cycles across multiple polling organizations. It was not a one-time emotional spike that disappeared as soon as people calmed down. The 2024 election, while real and consequential, was a specific election in a specific political environment against a specific opponent. It was not a general verdict on the legitimacy of every accountability demand made in response to every instance of specific conduct. The resign now demands are documented expressions of institutional and public accountability pressure. The fact that they did not produce resignation in the immediate term does not retrospectively invalidate the assessment that produced them. It tells you something about the limits of those demands as operational mechanisms. It does not tell you that the demands were wrong. So here's the bottom line on all of this. The AFL-CIO National Board called for Trump's immediate resignation or removal after January 6th. They were joined by Republican Senators Murkowski and Toomey, and supported by 56% of Americans in the ABC Ipsos polling. PBS documented Trump remaining defiant, planning border wall photo ops, and raging about his Twitter suspension rather than engaging with the accountability demands. That was the first moment. In the second moment, more than 70 Democratic lawmakers called for immediate removal via impeachment or the 25th Amendment after the civilization will die Iran post. NBC News documented those calls, and the behavioral response to the 2026 calls, the 1 a.m. Truth Social meltdowns, the all hell will rain down rhetoric, the naming and attacking of critics, all of that mirrors the defiance pattern that PBS documented after January 6th. Two crisis moments separated by 5 years. Same structural dynamic every time. Crisis produces resign, now demands from a significant institutional coalition. Trump digs in, refuses to engage, attacks his critics, focuses on personal grievances. The demands fizzle without the constitutional mechanisms being activated. That is a documented pattern. That is the empirical record. But here is what should keep you watching. If you think the twice-documented resign now pattern represents the ceiling of accountability pressure heading into the upcoming election, you might be missing the larger picture. The primary results, the MAGA influence revolt, the congressional war powers vote, the judicial constraints, and all of the other accountability mechanisms we have been documenting throughout this series are accumulating simultaneously as the election approaches. The resign now demands are the most dramatic expression of accountability pressure in the documented record, but they are one expression among many. And the question of whether the upcoming election produces the electoral conditions that make the constitutional accountability mechanisms more available, a Democratic House majority being the most obvious example, that is the question that determines whether the pattern produces a different outcome in its third iteration. You are going to want to be here as that question gets answered. Because if the pattern holds for a third time, that tells you one thing about the durability of Trump's political position. But if it breaks, if the demands finally translate into action, that tells you something else entirely about the limits of what the system can absorb. Either way, the story is far from over.